Hey, this is Pastor Dan. I want to thank you so much for joining with me today. We're going to be in Acts chapter 14, so I want to encourage you to go ahead and grab your Bible. Yesterday, when we were talking about Paul's first missionary journey, we saw a good bit of what had taken place. Towards the end, we saw that he was in Pisidian Antioch, and it looked like things were going really well. They were able to preach the gospel. The Jews seemed to be interested. They said, hey, why don't you come back and tell us more? Then, when the following Sabbath day came, the whole town seemed to come together to find out what was happening and what was going on. And so the Jews began to get jealous. And because of that jealousy, it caused Paul and it caused Barnabas to leave Pisidian Antioch, and they went on into Iconium. And so today we're going to pick up in chapter 14 and talking about how things went in the area of Iconium. And so we're going to continue to use the pictures and maps from Free Bible Images that they have provided. And granted, sometimes they're a little bit kiddie, but they can really help us understand, especially the journey that Paul is taking. So we'll use those today. All right, well, let's start in verse 1. It says this: in Iconium, they entered the Jewish synagogue as usual, and as we know, on Paul's missionary journeys, that's exactly what he did. He was always looking for a Jewish synagogue. In some places that they didn't have Jewish synagogues, he would be looking simply for believers or people that were God-fearing. And so he enters a Jewish synagogue as usual and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. Of course, it's talking about believing in Jesus. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they stayed there a long time and spoke boldly for the Lord, who testified to the message of his grace by enabling them to do signs and wonders. So they're able to do all kinds of signs and all kinds of wonders. And so really what you've got is you've got a divided city here, because you've got Jews and Greeks both who have believed, but then you've got this other group over here of unbelieving Jews that aren't going to believe. So really you've got this divided city going on. So let's see what happens with that. But the people of the city, just like it says, were divided, some siding with the Jews and others with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat and stone them, they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian towns of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding countryside, and there they continued to preach the gospel. So they find out, oh, this isn't going as well as we thought it was. It's starting to go south. And so they find out that they are about to be mistreated or even stoned. The people wanted them killed. And so here what happens is they go on to these other towns of Lystra and Derbe. So let's see what happens in those areas. Look in verse 8. In Lystra, a man was sitting who was without strength in his feet, had never walked, and had been lame from birth. So Paul and Barnabas had been doing some miraculous things in previous cities, and so here, I mean, it's just like any other city that they've been to. And so they're thinking, okay, we'll do some more things. And typically, we've talked about the pattern that has taken place. Paul and Barnabas do a miraculous act. People go, wow, they come crowding in, and then they're able to share the gospel. Well, this is one of those instances that things didn't go quite as planned. So let's see what happens. So he listened to Paul and spoke, verse 9 says, and after looking directly at him, seeing that he had faith to be healed, Paul said in a loud voice, stand up on your feet, and he jumped up and began to walk around. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the town, brought bulls and wreaths to the gates because they intended with the crowds to offer sacrifice. So a couple things that are going on here. So they called Paul Hermes. Who in the world was Hermes? Well, Hermes was essentially the messenger of the gods. Okay? Now, he was also known as a divine trickster, okay? And he was the patron of herdsmen, thieves, graves, and heralds. So certainly not everything lined up perfectly, but primarily that Hermes was the messenger of the god and of the gods. And who was the primary speaker here? The primary speaker was Paul. So they're looking at Paul thinking this guy has the power of the gods. So they think that he is Hermes. All right. So what about Zeus? Well, let's take a look at Zeus. Zeus, who they thought Barnabas was, Zeus was the sky and thunder god of the ancient Greek religion, okay? And so they thought he was the king of the gods on Mount Olympus. And so what was happening here is they had his temple right outside the town, right outside the town of Lystra. They had a temple to him. And of course, what's going to be in the temple? There's going to be priests. And so when they see these miraculous powers, instead of thinking, okay, wow, what's going on, and rushing in and hearing what these men have to say, instead of all that, instead they just assume that these guys are the Greek gods. And so they began to rush in with the priests. They began to rush in with animals. They're about to sacrifice animals to these guys. And so here's what happens. In verse 14 it says, the apostles Barnabas and Paul, look at this, they tore their robes when they heard this and rushed the crowd saying, people, why are you doing these things? We are people also. In other words, we are human beings just like you. We're not gods. And we are proclaiming good news to you that you turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. And so what are they doing? They're saying, listen, there's one God. Not all these other different gods. There's one God. And they list some of the things that he's made here. Who made heaven, okay? Who made the earth? Who made the sea and everything in them? See, all these other things had their different separate gods in the Greek culture. And they're saying, no. We have one God who has made all of these things, okay? And then in verse 16 it says, in past generations he allowed all the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness, since he did what was good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. Even though they said these things, they barely stopped the crowds from sacrificing. So immediately they're trying to share the gospel as fast as they possibly can. There's this overarching God, and this overarching God has taken care of you, even though you didn't know him, even though that you didn't know who was the one taking care of you. And essentially what they are talking about here is they're talking about general grace. The general grace that God sends the rain on the just and the unjust. He fills the stomachs of people that are righteous and the people that are unrighteous, the people that know him and the people that don't know him. So that's what general grace is. And that's what they're talking about here. He has given you grace and you didn't even know it. So as fast as they can, they're trying to share the gospel. Now, we really don't see an outcome from this instance other than the fact that they're having just immense trouble trying to convince the crowds. Well, in the meantime, remember the city that they just came from was Pisidian Antioch. In the meantime, people from Pisidian Antioch and Iconium, remember they had some issues in Iconium we talked about earlier in the chapter, they come in and it says that these Jews, which were anti-Paul, anti-Barnabas, anti-Christianity, says that they came in and they won over the crowds. They stoned Paul. So imagine this, Paul just does a miracle, saves a man's legs, allows him to walk, and man, this whole ordeal gets mixed up. They take Paul and they stone him and drag him out of the city, and the verse says, thinking he was dead. After the disciples gathered around him, he got up and went into the town. The next day, he left with Barnabas for Derbe. So Paul survived this miraculously. God allowed him to survive this and allowed him to be okay. And then after that, we see what the Apostle Paul and Barnabas do is essentially what we're going to see is they're going to go from Derbe, where they're sharing the gospel at this point, and they're just going to backtrack themselves. And then instead of going back into Cyprus, remember the island, they're just going to sail on home. I think I have a picture for that to show you. So they're just going to go ahead and they're going to be able to sail on home and go back to their home church, which was Antioch and Caesarea. Okay, so let's read this. It says, after they had preached the gospel in the town and made many disciples, so it's talking about Derbe, they returned to Lystra. Man, I don't know if I would have done that. That's the place where he got stoned. To Iconium. That's the place where all kinds of craziness was stirred up. To Antioch. This is Pisidian Antioch. Strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith and by telling them it is necessary to go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church and prayed with fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. So essentially why did Paul and Barnabas, why did they turn around and go back through all those places? Well, because the work was undone. I mean, they evangelized, okay, so they evangelized these areas, but they didn't set up churches, and that's what they're going to do. They're going to go back around the way that they came, and they're going to set up churches, and not only that, they're going to establish leaders in those churches that are called elders, okay? In verse 24, it says they passed through Pisidian and came to Pamphylia, and after they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. From there, they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. After they arrived and gathered the church together, they reported everything God had done with them and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, and they spent a considerable amount of time with the disciples. And so essentially what they're going to do is they're going to go back to their home church, which is Antioch, and they're going to share all about their journey. They're going to share all about what God has done, and the people are going to rejoice, and they're going to stay in Antioch, and they're going to get refreshed, and then later on we'll see them go out again into a second missionary journey. Okay, well, that's going to wrap us up today, and so we're going to stop here, and we will come back tomorrow with Acts chapter 15. I'll see you there.